Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the abrupt cancellation of the $770 billion trade relationship between the United States and Canada wasn't really about trade at all, and that the real driver wasn't a high level policy dispute, but a 30-second television commercial, a deeply bruised ego, and the final public collapse of a failing negotiation? In the turbulent world of 21st century geopolitics, the relationship between the United States and Canada has long been championed as a model of stability, a quiet partnership built on shared values, integrated economies, and the world's longest undefended border. This perception, however, was shattered by the transactional and volatile America First doctrine of President Donald Trump. In the autumn of 2025, this simmering tension boiled over into an unprecedented public rupture. With a single explosive social media post, President Trump declared he was terminating all trade negotiations with Canada, a move that stunned observers and sent shockwaves through the diplomatic corps. The president's official justification was a seemingly minor provincial advertising campaign, but this public-facing catalyst was in reality a carefully chosen pretext. The abrupt cancellation of the Canadian trade deal was not the result of a single advertisement. It was the culmination of a failing, one-sided negotiation, a desperate maneuver to deflect from domestic political vulnerabilities, and, most profoundly, a public symptom of a deep strategic breakdown in the North American alliance. The real reason was not about a 30-second television spot. It was about the end of an era, revealing a frustrated president who saw a zero-sum game he was losing, and an allied nation finally realizing it could no longer trust its closest friend. So, let's first look at the official justification, the public-facing catalyst for all of this. The spark that ostensibly lit the diplomatic fuse originated not from the halls of Parliament in Ottawa, but from the provincial government of Ontario, led by Premier Doug Ford. This was not a random act of political defiance, but a calculated strategic move born of economic desperation. The spark that ostensibly lit the diplomatic fuse originated not from the halls of Parliament in Ottawa, but from the provincial government of Ontario, led by Premier Doug Ford. This was not a random act of political defiance, but a calculated strategic move born of economic desperation. Ontario's economy, with its heavy reliance on the cross-border auto industry, had been particularly hit, as one analyst noted, by the constant threat and implementation of American tariffs. Ford's government, seeking to apply pressure and build American public support, launched a targeted advertising campaign aimed squarely at the constituents of U.S. lawmakers. The ad's content was its most potent and, as it turned out, inflammatory element. It was a montage of audio excerpts from a national radio address delivered in 1987 by one of the Republican Party's most revered figures, former President Ronald Reagan. In the clips, Reagan's iconic voice served as a ghostly rebuke to the protectionist policies of the current administration. He warned in no uncertain terms that high tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. He spoke of a downward spiral where markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs, concluding that the path to prosperity was rejecting protectionist legislation and promoting fair and free competition. The ad's strategic purpose was twofold. First, it was designed to air during high visibility, culturally significant American events, including the World Series, ensuring maximum exposure. Second, by using Reagan, Premier Ford was attempting to speak directly to conservatives in conservative states, bypassing the White House and appealing to the free trade wing of the Republican Party. It was a sophisticated maneuver, an attempt to use America's own political history as a weapon in a modern trade dispute. The Ontario government was, in effect, reminding Republican voters and their representatives that their current president's economic policies were in direct opposition to the foundational principles of their party's most celebrated modern icon. This nuanced political messaging was entirely lost on, or more likely, willfully ignored by President Trump. His retaliation was immediate, public, and disproportionate. The entire affair began to snowball when the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute posted a complaint on social media, ironically misrepresenting the ad by claiming it misrepresented Reagan's speech. This was all the ammunition President Trump needed. Seizing on the foundation's complaint, he launched a volley of posts on his own social media platform. He declared the advertisement fake and fraudulent in a stunning display of historical revisionism. Trump, who famously appropriated Reagan's Make America Great Again slogan, falsely claimed that the former president had, in fact, loved tariffs. The distinction between a provincial government and a national one was completely erased. Trump's posts angrily and repeatedly blamed the entire Canadian government for the ad escalating a regional issue into a full-blown national conflict. The tirade reached its climax in a characteristically dramatic all-caps declaration that sent tremors through the $770 billion trade relationship. Based on their egregious behavior, all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated. With that, the official story was set. Canada had cheated, been caught, and would now be punished. Leadership. Based on their egregious behavior, all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated. With that, the official story was set. Canada had cheated, been caught, and would now be punished. But, as you might have guessed, that official story was just that, a story. This public-facing excuse, however, crumbled under the weight of behind-the-scenes realities. The Reagan ad was not the reason for the cancellation. It was a convenient pretext. The true narrative was one of a deeply frustrated president lashing out as his strong-arm negotiating tactics failed to yield the one-sided victory he demanded. While Canadian officials, including Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc's office, had cautiously stated just 2 days prior that the talks were making progress, this was, ironically, a red flag for the White House. President Trump's entire worldview is infamously built on a zero-sum game mentality. In his mind, negotiation is not a path to mutual benefit, but a battlefield where one side wins and the other loses. As one commentator astutely observed, if Canada believed it was making progress, Trump, by his own logic, must have felt he was losing ground. This private frustration was confirmed by White House insiders. Kevin Hassett, the director of the White House Economic Council, revealed to reporters that President Trump had become frustrated with the talks. The reason? Canada, in Trump's view, had been very difficult to negotiate with. This single quote laid bare the reality of the situation. Difficult to negotiate with was White House code for unwilling to capitulate. The Canadian delegation, led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, was refusing to simply roll over and accept the massively one sided trade deal Trump was pushing. They were holding their ground, engaging in the patient, detailed, and substantive negotiations that are the hallmark of international diplomacy, a process for which President Trump has neither the patience nor the inclination. Therefore, the Reagan ad became the perfect escape hatch. It was what one source described as a wholly manufactured spot of outrage, a hissy fit designed to flip the negotiating table and reframe the narrative. The cancellation was not a reasoned policy decision, it was a bullying tactic. By manufacturing a public grievance, Trump could punish Canada for its perceived intransigence. The goal was to shake them into a higher degree of submissiveness, to create a crisis so severe that Ottawa would come crawling back to the table, ready to concede on key issues like steel, aluminum, and autos. It was a classic Trump maneuver. When you can't win the game, set the game on fire and declare yourself the victim. This understanding of the president's transactional nature explains the financial market's baffling reaction to the news. The announcement that the United States was ending trade talks with its largest trading partner, a move that should have sent markets into a freefall, was met with a collective yawn. Markets, as one financial journalist explained, have become inured to the president's fickle nature. His waking up on the wrong side of the bed antics are no longer seen as credible signals of long term policy, but as atmospherics. Investors and analysts had learned to differentiate between Trump's feigned indignation and a genuine economic rupture. They correctly diagnosed the situation not as the end of the $770 billion trade relationship, but as a temporary theatrical pause. The consensus was that this was a public performance, a lever pulled to gain a rhetorical game and secure a trophy. The widespread belief was that talks would inevitably resume, but only after President Trump had been given some form of public concession that he could frame as a personal win. The ad was merely the stage dressing for this predictable drama. But this drama wasn't just about a frustrated negotiator, and the frustration wasn't limited to the negotiating table alone. The president's explosive reaction was also fueled by a potent mix of domestic political anxieties. The Ontario ad, arriving when it did, struck two of Trump's most sensitive nerves, his legal vulnerabilities and his personal ego. The timing of the ad campaign was, for the White House, politically irritating to the extreme. It was not just a random insult, it landed at a moment of acute legal peril for the Trump administration. The United States Supreme Court was scheduled to begin hearing arguments in the following month on the fundamental legality of the president's entire tariff strategy. This was not a minor case. It was a constitutional challenge that threatened to dismantle the central pillar of his America First economic policy. In his social media posts, Trump himself revealed this anxiety, explicitly accusing Canada of launching the ad to interfere with the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court and other courts. Whether this was a genuine belief or a paranoid projection, it demonstrated that the ad was perceived as a direct intervention in a finely balanced domestic legal battle. By running the ad in key American states, Ontario was, in Trump's view, attempting to influence American public opinion and, by extension, the judiciary, right before this critical hearing. The Canadian ad, therefore, was not just an economic argument, it was a political threat that added immense pressure to an already high stakes legal showdown. The second nerve the ad struck was purely personal, but in the context of the Trump presidency, personal grievance is indistinguishable from national policy. The ad touched a nerve, as multiple analysts noted, because it didn't just criticize protectionism, it used the sainted figure of Ronald Reagan to do it. For a president obsessed with his image and his standing within the Republican Party, this was an unforgivable offense. It was heresy. It directly exposed the deep ideological rift that Trump's presidency had carved through the GOP. It forced a direct public comparison between Reagan's optimistic free trade conservatism and Trump's dark America First protectionism. The ad effectively weaponized a Republican icon against a sitting Republican president, painting Trump as an imposter who had hijacked the party's legacy. Reagan's words, broadcast during the World Series, were a powerful message to Trump's own base that their leader was betraying the very principles he claimed to champion. This personal and political affront, which challenged his legitimacy as the leader of the party of Reagan, could not be tolerated. The egregious behavior Trump cited was not just Canada's, it was the ad's success in exposing this raw ideological contradiction. And while the legal threats and the personal ego were critical, they all point to something even bigger, something more profound. Perhaps the most profound and lasting real reason for the trade deal's cancellation had little to do with the immediate theatrics. The manufactured outrage over the Reagan ad was merely a symptom of a much deeper, structural, and perhaps irreversible sickness. The fundamental breakdown of the US Canada relationship and the death of America's role as a reliable global partner. This stark reality was captured in the sober, measured response of Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. While Trump was posting in all caps, Carney was delivering a somber, clear-eyed assessment of the New World Order. We can't control the trade policy of the United States, he stated, acknowledging a fundamental change from the pro-trade consensus that had governed the relationship for decades through both Republican and Democratic administrations since the 1980s. The old rules no longer applied. This was not just a diplomatic disagreement, it was a paradigm shift. Canada, like many U.S. allies, had come to view the United States under Trump not as a partner, but as a pariah on international trade. In the most stunning statement of the entire affair, Prime Minister Carney explicitly said that the trade risk from the United States is now similar to the risks that we face with China. For the leader of Canada to equate the risk posed by its democratic neighbor and largest trading partner with that of an authoritarian geopolitical rival was a seismic declaration. It signaled that, in Ottawa's view, the United States was no longer a predictable, rules-based actor, but a rogue agent, just as capricious and dangerous as Beijing. This grim assessment was not based on rhetoric alone, but on bitter experience. Canada was being forced to pivot because it felt left high and dry by its supposed ally. The case of Meng Wanzhou, the Huawei executive, was the defining example. Canada had arrested Wanzhou at the request of the United States, a move that put it in China's direct line of fire. When Beijing retaliated by arresting and imprisoning two Canadian citizens, the two Michaels, in an obvious act of hostage diplomacy, the Trump administration offered no meaningful support. Canada had stuck its neck out for the United States, and in return was abandoned to face the consequences alone. The lesson was brutal and clear. Loyalty to the Trump administration was a one-way street. As a direct consequence, Canada is moving on. The simultaneous timing of Prime Minister Carney's trip to Asia was no coincidence. It was a tangible demonstration of Canada's new strategic imperative. As the Prime Minister himself stated, the trip was focused on building new partnerships with the economic giants of Asia, a clear and deliberate strategy to find alternatives to American dependency. This pivot is a reaction to what many have called the death of the American century. In just a few years, President Trump's America First policies have successfully achieved what no rival power ever could. They have abdicated America's role as the leader of the free world and convinced its closest friends that they are better off looking elsewhere for partnership, stability, and trade. Canada's overtures to Asia are the quiet, pragmatic, and necessary response to this new reality. This shift, this death of the American century, deserves a closer look, as it represents the most profound and lasting real reason for the break. For more than 75 years, the entire architecture of Canadian economic, defense, and foreign policy was built upon a single, immovable assumption: the fundamental reliability and shared interest of the United States. This alliance was not just a treaty, it was the central nervous system of the Canadian state. Prime Minister Carney's equating the US with China was not just a clever turn of phrase, it was the public announcement that this central assumption was now dead. The unthinkable had become official policy. This pivot, therefore, is not a simple short term search for new markets. It is a generational re engineering of Canada's place in the world. Carney's trip to Asia, timed perfectly against this backdrop, was the first concrete step in this new reality. It signaled to the economic giants of the Asia Pacific nations like Japan, South Korea, and the partners in the Trans Pacific Partnership that Canada was, for the first time, truly open for business in a way that was not subordinate to its relationship with Washington. This has immense consequences, particularly in sectors vital to the 21st century. Canada is a powerhouse of critical minerals and rare earth elements, the essential building blocks for everything from electric vehicle batteries to advanced microchips and defense systems. By treating Canada as a hostile actor, the Trump administration was, in an act of breathtaking strategic malpractice, actively pushing these vital resources away from the United States and into the open arms of European and Asian partners, or worse, leaving a vacuum for Chinese influence. This was not just losing a negotiation, it was jeopardizing the entire future supply chain of the North American continent over a personal spat. Furthermore, this Canadian pivot was not happening in isolation. It was a mirror of similar conversations taking place in capitals across the Allied world. In Berlin, Brussels, and Tokyo, leaders who had once looked to Washington for guidance were now actively developing strategies for strategic autonomy. The European Union, stung by the same America First tariffs on steel and automobiles, was aggressively pursuing its own trade deals, strengthening its internal market, and building regulatory frameworks that explicitly excluded American influence. The transactional nature of the Trump administration, its view of alliances not as permanent, values based partnerships, but as temporary, fee for service arrangements, had sent a clear message to the world: you are on your own. Trump believed he was using leverage to win better deals. What he was actually doing was destroying the very leverage he held: the trust, credibility, and global framework that America had spent a century building. This is the tragic feedback loop of the America First doctrine. The president's capricious bullying, designed to force a win, instead convinces allies to build new systems that bypass the United States entirely, ultimately resulting in a permanent loss of American power and influence. Canada's pivot was simply the most striking and painful example of this dynamic inaction. So, where did this leave things on the ground? The immediate tangible fallout from President Trump's social media tirade was the death of a nearly finalized agreement. Sources from both sides had indicated that negotiators were close to signing a near term deal on steel and aluminum. In the face of this chaos, Canada's official stance was a study in contrasts. While President Trump performed for his base, Prime Minister Mark Carney projected calm, professionalism, and a resolute refusal to be drawn into the drama. He declined to respond in kind, instead issuing a measured statement that gracefully placed the blame for the impasse on Washington while leaving the door open for a return to sanity. He confirmed that progress had been made and stated that Canada stood ready to build on that progress when the Americans are ready to have those discussions. It was the quintessential adult in the room posture, a subtle but firm message that Canada would not be bullied and that real negotiations could resume whenever the United States was finished with its hissy fit. Ultimately, the real reason President Trump pulled the Canada trade deal was a complex tapestry of ego, strategy, and failure. The Ontario ad featuring Ronald Reagan was the perfect pretext, a public facing justification that allowed him to cloak a negotiating failure in the garb of patriotic indignation. It provided a scapegoat for a frustrated president who was unable to force a massively one sided deal on a difficult, which is to say, competent Canadian team. It also served as a convenient distraction from his acute domestic, political, and legal vulnerabilities, particularly the looming Supreme Court challenge to his entire tariff regime. But the realist reason was also the most tragic. The entire episode was a powerful and public symptom of a fundamental rupture in the North American alliance. It exposed the end of the American century, where the United States, under a transactional and fickle president, is no longer viewed as a reliable ally, but as a pariah on the level of its geopolitical adversaries. The abrupt cancellation was not just a negotiating tactic, it was the visible proof of America's abdication of leadership, a move so profound that it has forced its closest and most loyal neighbor to move on and seek its future elsewhere.